Welcome to the Lair Secrets Podcast, a podcast about exploring the sprawling caverns of gaming, hidden treasures of geekdom, and the unexpected intersections of reality. On this episode, we're talking about generative AI as a tool in gaming. We're going to be looking at how the overhyped tech can assist both game masters and players. So what do we mean when we talk about AI, or what's the scope of AI for tonight's conversation?
I'm glad you asked, Ken.
It's almost like you're doing it a second time.
Yes.
Deja vu.
I'm caught in a time loop.
All right. So here's the thing. There's lots of things that they call AI out there that we've had these things for a number of years, and we'll get. But for this conversation, the stuff dealing with gaming, we're primarily talking about generative AI. So the most common example of this would be ChatGPT, large language models. There are many types of large language models out there. Also image generation, occasionally music generation. But the kind of things that I think these are the most common things that we've touched on when we run into this. And we're going to touch on video games and AI, but we're mostly talking about tabletop, I think, tonight.
Yeah. How we use it, how you can use it in your own home games. We've talked about the ethics of it before. And I don't think we're going to necessarily go into the ethics of it because we're talking about personal use of it, not publishing it. But if you want to know the technical side, which is we're also not going to go into the super deep technical side, I recommend Kyle Hill's. He's a science educator on YouTube. We'll have the link in the show notes. He goes into how like large language models like ChatGPT have sucked in huge amounts of text and then had lots and lots of math done to all of that text to effectively and not a little pejoratively maybe, but effectively it's a very sophisticated autocomplete is one of the ways to look at ChatGPT. But tonight we're going to talk about using it at your own table, and but we're going to talk a little bit about how we got here. What is the role of AI in gaming history?
Generative AI has been around a long, long time. There's been we've been using it for decades in games, in particular. Some simple games like Eliza, the famous quote psychoanalyst from the 60s. Dwarf Fortress and Deep Rock Galactic use it for procedural level generation, environment generation. Ubisoft's Ghostwriter AI helps scriptwriters in creating NPC dialogues and such. So, we've got these things hooked in already, and the gaming industry, particularly video games, are going to be using this more and more. I'm sure you're going to begin seeing it in some of the games that are coming out. But as far as RPGs, like tabletop RPGs, this is the first time that it's really been put into our hands, unless you're talking about, writing your own scripts for like oracles and treasure generation and that kind of thing. This is the first time that we can kind of bring the robot to the table and have it do our bidding as a little GM assistant.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I view it, is more of an oracle. We had an earlier episode talking all about oracles and how you can make your own, having those random encounter tables, etc. I have used AI at the table to enhance my own creativity. It allows me to do things like generate NPCs, generate some backstory that makes sense in the world setting that I have been creating. It even helps with world building itself. And we can go into each of the things that we have listed here. I've kind of touched on them a little bit, but that's how I've generally used it, is both for prep and also at the table itself.
Mm-hmm. I find it to be a useful off-board brain. I will use it to check rules. There's in my gaming group, there's a lot of discussion about the rogue sneak attack, which is not a sneak attack in 5e. It's taking advantage of a situation, but it is in no way a backstab or anything like that. But that's what you have been brought, so we're always like, how does this work again? What is it? And so being able to, I really like the idea of being able to query a text. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Not just search it, but have something that is more of a conversational interface to do. And I find ChatGPT in particular to be very useful for that, especially with some of the plugins that they have, where you can have it read a PDF and then you can query the PDF through it. That's been very useful. When your characters, take a left-hand turn into some area that you didn't expect, having it. I mean, you can do this with some really great books out there. Like you could have a number of things prepared. Random taverns or plots that you can just pick up. But assuming that you are not that well prepared, having it be able to generate something. So, for instance, I'm running the Icewind Dale game, Rime of the Frost Maiden, and when I start the game, I kick it off and tell it, I need you to be an expert in D&D 5th edition, and in particular, this adventure, and
Gotcha.
we're going to run this thing. And I will say, well, at this point in the game, they decided to go do this other thing and go backwards. How might I handle that? Or what might happen because of that? Or that kind of thing. And I don't always use it, but it's really a kind of a kickstart. Like
it gives you some prompts.
About oracles.
Like you prompt it, but it's kind of a prompt for you, like a writing prompt.
Right, exactly. There's a little teamwork going on there.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate having that intern, to sit next to me and help me out.
Yep.
So
I've actually used it at the table as well. Similar sort of situation, but in like a clutch. I have no idea what I should put here because so in our side passage adventure that we ran a couple Saturdays ago, I also run that same game at home. And so obviously everybody does something different. So at one point they're in a room and there is, they came in through a set of doors. They don't want to leave by those set of doors. And there is a window, but they know there are gloom spiders, which is something that ChatGPT helped me come up with as well, outside of that window. And they're like, we don't want to go through that window. And I'm like, well, those are the only two exits to this room. And they're like, well, I want to start looking around for, because it's a Victorian steampunky type setting. They're like, I want to start looking around for like secret doors or secret rooms or anything like that. And so like, I allow that there is one and I prompt ChatGPT. I'm like, so I would like an alcove, a secret alcove in a trophy room that has like a shrine in it. Can you tell me what's in that shrine? And it came up with like what's in the shrine and like a name of the deity that the shrine, like this just completely this was not in any of the prompt history up until now. It came up with a name for it, etc. And I allowed for them to find it, to learn a little bit more about who owned the building that room was in. And then they would be able to kind of like smash through the back wall because it was thinner there, that they would be able to leave the room that way if they didn't want to go out the window. And so all I did for that was I had the iPad there sitting to the side with ChatGPT already up with the prompt that I'd been doing this world building in. And I just asked it the question of like, hey, what could be in this alcove? And it gave me a couple of possible responses. I chose one and then it gave me some more stuff. And then so I took it from there and then added more to it as I ran for the rest of the group.
Yeah, I actually just had this on Sunday night with my D&D group. We have my Elemental Apocalypse game. They just defeated the Fire Mage. They had retreated and realized that they might be able to get tracked back to their home base, so they wanted to find a place to hide. And so they made their survival checks, and kind of on the fly, it was the druid who was doing it, and I'm trying to make this kind of like this over-the-top setting where there's all kinds of weird stuff going on, right? Elemental incursions and what have you. And so somehow we stumbled across the idea of an intelligent waterfall. And so I went into ChatGPT and I said, create motivations for an intelligent waterfall in Dungeons and Dragons. And then it spit out 5. one of which was mysterious lore keeper. And I'm like, okay, I like this idea, right? So I start running, like that's pretty much how I used it. And I did like a little bit of, I asked it for synonyms for waterfall, right? So I could come up with something that sounded a little bit more interesting than just like waterfall, right? Like I think it ends up being like the torrent of erudition, whatever, which we're just going to call it the torrent going forward. But in any case, like, boom, we were very quickly able to just in the game come up with that. And like to Chris's point, you could have had random tables that would let you get to the same point, but it was all just a wee bit faster to just kind of whisper over to my little, DM AI, hey buddy, you got some ideas for an intelligent waterfall? Because I got to keep these guys occupied.
Yep. Although now that you're talking about that, I want the fact that I kind of want to have the fact that it's a constantly flowing waterfall that dispenses wisdom, that it just won't shut up.
Stop generating. Generating.
It just keeps talking all the time, giving little facts out. Very Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah. So another place where I used it, which was, and I think this is one of our examples as well, was I struggle sometimes with building my NPCs, especially for D&D, because they can be so beefy, right? Especially when you get to higher level things where, and the tools like D&D Beyond is okay, but still there's just so many options. So I gave it the prompt, what is the optimum build for an 8th level fire-based sorcerer for Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition? Explain your reasoning.
Oh,
and
wow.
Then it talks through, okay, well, your species should be tiefling, your class, obviously sorcerer. Go with sage because it's going to give you these background proficiencies. These are you should take firebolt because it's a good reliable source of fire damage. You should also take control flames for utility and flavor. And then it broke down at the other higher levels. Well, and it said fireball is practically mandatory for a fire focused sorcerer, right? And so it provided me with a fair amount of inspiration. But then I realized, you know what? You didn't include a bloodline. So I had to tell it, include a bloodline, right? And so then it refactored it and included the draconic bloodline. Okay, cool. And then as I'm converting this into D&D Beyond, because again, I'm not necessarily taking what it spit out because I don't trust it. And I think we're going to talk about this some. Like, it kind of knows the rules, kind of like I'm trying to think of the right word. It's like a rules lawyer that's willing to change its mind as soon as you tell it to change its mind.
Yeah.
So it speaks very authoritatively about the rules that it thinks it understands, but maybe perhaps does not. So I'm like, an 8th level sorcerer should only know 9 spells, because as I'm putting this into D&D Beyond, I see that it's not fitting together, right? And so I was like, oh, I apologize for the confusion. You're absolutely correct. And then it gives me the math to how you get to the number of spells for an 8th level sorcerer, and then it regurgitated the spell list. And so it was cool. Like the back and forth was helpful for me to get the inspiration for the character that eventually became the big bad sorcerer they had to destroy.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that is cool. That is really cool. I've used it for puzzles and riddles. One of my characters actually had it write a poem that he recited as part of his character's thing. It's a useful brainstorming machine. I get a lot out of back and forth, with people when I'm creating things, whether
right,
work or game creation, because I think we've all done game creation and such. And to me, this is just a single person version of that. And I talk about interns a whole lot. It can be very confidently wrong.
Yeah.
Right. But I try to keep it in the vein of, in a good brainstorm, there are no terrible answers. There's just data to be worked with.
Yeah.
And so, that is one way that I kind of keep in mind what I'm doing. You don't take all the stuff that it says and throw it straight into your game. You read it and kind of go, all right, I like this. I'm going to cherry pick that, and I'm going to expand on this. And you may go back to the tool and say, hey, expand on this a little bit. What did you mean? And it doesn't mean anything. I think we've talked about that. It's not intelligent, but it feels like it sometimes.
Right.
I mean, and going into it's not always right, and that you want to read things before you use them is when I made characters, NPCs, with some backgrounds for the game, and I was also trying to do this. I was trying to do the Sundered Skies stuff as a one shot, and so I had it just build up. I just had it build regular characters, and two things happened during that process. One, when I was having it generate some backstories and interesting things for the actual characters, I was like, give me the Savage World character sheet for this. And it did. It very confidently did. But then going through every single character sheet, all of their, like, the number of skills that Savage Worlds gives you was not the number of skills that ChatGPT gave me. ChatGPT was a bit more generous than the actual Savage Worlds was. Now, as a one shot, I didn't care, and it was really like one extra skill point that got added in, and that was fine. But had I not looked at it, and if this was some sort of really important thing, then that could have been a problem. But having read it, I was like, okay, that's good enough. I'm fine with that. It's a one shot. I'm not worried about like long-term game balance or whatever. It'll be fine. The other part, though, was like I was making NPCs, and I was like, oh, can you give me a little bit more information here? Can you give me a little more information here? And they're like, sure, let's talk about that. Let's put some of your info in, and here's an updated prompt, and we're going through, and suddenly my NPC's name changed.
Yep.
And sex. Like suddenly it went from a woman with a particular name to a man with a particular name. I'm like, what happened here?
I'm sorry, go on. I apologize.
Supposedly ChatGPT has gotten much better with hallucinating, as they call it, as a prompt gets deeper and deeper and deeper. But also, it's while it is an AI, it is not built like a computer, so it technically doesn't know how to do math correctly.
Right.
100% of the time. Like, it will do it correctly, but sometimes it'll do it incorrectly and be very confident that that's the right answer.
When we were creating our characters for Cyberpunk game, I was using ChatGPT to help flesh out APT. And there came a point where every time I asked it about APT's past, the names of the clans and the names of her parent, every paragraph it was changing and such. So that's the kind of thing that, and that's the thing you keep out, this is raw material to play with. I don't know about you guys, but as I've gotten older, it is harder to summon the raw material out of my brain unless I'm going to blatantly steal it from a book that I have loved.
I'm going to say this. When I was younger, blatantly stealing it out of a book was perfectly fine back then, too.
And it still is. But what I'm saying is that, having the raw material at your fingertips, having it be able to give you this data, like for a fire mage, or treasure for an 8th level dungeon that had giants, or that kind of thing, and then you can pick and choose it, giving you options as an options machine. I find it to be really, really useful.
And I would say that those options are great, and the fact that, like, pulling out that raw creative material, like, I think when you enter the workforce and start having to work most of the time instead of daydreaming in the middle of class during the day, like, your amount of free time and the amount of creative material, I think, are like equivalent. They're equivalent proportions. And so with the loss of the free time, and having to do work or a commute or whatever, the creativeness does tend to wane. unless you really work at it.
Yeah, and it's a huge context shifting is huge too. I mean, we know this just at work. Switching context has a cost, right? But like to go from, like you were saying, like working all day, juggling parents, juggling kids, juggling volunteer activities, and then all of a sudden it's like I need to come up with a fire-based adventuring band for my elemental campaign for Sunday. Oh, geez, how am I going to make 5 NPCs by then? Right? Like, I don't have like a whole like 4 hour. I can't stay up until 2 a.m. anymore doing that.
Right.
And so I think that's where it's really helped.
I like the. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Go on, Ken.
What I was going to say was like riffing on what Chris was saying earlier about doing things that perhaps we hadn't done before, or we would have done if we had more time, or we only occasionally did when we had the time, which was like, hey, I've got this innkeeper NPC, and these are the things he typically says, right? And so being able to ask the ChatGPT, spit this out for me. So I was doing this with, I was going to have, one of my encounters was going to be a battle between fire elementals and fire para elementals. Right. So, earth, fire, earth, land, whatever, magma elementals. Right. And so part of the campaign is there's this antagonism between the elemental forces, which want to destroy the world, and the para elemental forces, which are like, we kind of like creating stuff. I mean, we want to destroy it first, but like, what have you. And so I wanted them to be able to generate insults. So I said, create 5 insults targeting fire para elementals that could be slung at them, and it came up with some were stupid, but some of them are like, I've seen campfires that were more intimidated than you. That's a pretty good insult.
Nice.
You're so weak, I bet even water could put you out, right? That's okay. The funny thing, and I guess this is, we're kind of jumping around in our notes, but you occasionally come up against weird limitations within ChatGPT. I had it rolling dice periodically, and then spontaneously for one of my chats, it decided it wasn't allowed to roll dice. Like that is a chaos, and that is a game of chance. I am not allowed to do games of chance, and so I cannot roll dice for you. But here's some resources where you can go and find to roll dice.
Wow.
And then when I told it, after I had created the insults for the para elementals, I needed to create some insults for tieflings, because the para elementals were actually going to be fighting tieflings, now that I remember. But it says, I cannot fulfill this request because it goes against OpenAI's content policy, which prohibits creating inappropriate or offensive content. So then I turned around and did the same thing for elves, create 5 insults targeting elves. It's totally fine with insulting elves. So
tieflings are a protected class.
Tieflings are a protected class.
I guess.
But it was great, right? Like, it was certain, like, and again, not all of them are going to be awesome, but I think it gets the ideas going, and like you take that and you're going to twist it a little bit and add that little bit of humanity to it.
Yeah. So we've talked about just now some NPC dialogue generation. We've talked a little bit about world building and NPC character generation. We've talked about some backstory for characters, rules clarification. We talked about you do have to be like, if you're going to clarify rules, I'm going to have a little aside here, which is say, hey, let's do it this way. It's kind of the whole, we want to keep the game moving. Let's do it this way for now. And then we'll really look it up or discuss it later. That's because the whole math thing or all that kind of stuff, the hallucination, who knows what ChatGPT is actually going out and doing it. So some of the other things that we have listed here is like scenario planning, the campaign backstory creation. I did some of that with Sundered Skies. I was like, I knew I wanted something like steampunk meets Sliders and or Stargate SG-1. And so I put in some stuff about like how a portal had destroyed the steampunk world, etc. But like, tell me about the country, this main country that the characters come from. And so it gave me some info about that and some other stuff. What was funny is because of the way that I wrote the prompt, it was always writing about it in past tense, as if it had already been destroyed, because that's the way I wrote the prompt to describe the setting. And so it's like telling me a history lesson at this point. And I thought that was pretty cool. And I think, Ken, did you use it at all for your Elemental Apocalypse game for like the backstory, or was that was mostly out of your head in the first place?
It was mostly out of my head. I think most of what I've been using it for has been NPC creation and then kind of riffing on some of the things that have come up. So I have thought, one area where I've thought about, because I've been trying to do oversized battlefields, is using it to say, given 4 PCs with the following high level capabilities, going up against, an equal number of, like, what would be a valid threat for them in a burning forest or in a volcano or, some other elemental themed type thing. And it's good at coming up with prompts for that, right? A lot of times it kind of returns to the same well. It's like, yes, as I tell it, hey, I've got this fire themed barbarian, give me 3 magic items for it. There's always going to be flame tongue, because there aren't that many, a flame tongue sword, because there's not that many magical items that are fire themed, right? And it's not necessarily going to spawn new stuff without additional prompting. But backstory, for me, the universe, I haven't had that particular problem. For me, it's the actual day-to-day details of getting the freaking scenario ready to run on Sunday.
Yeah, I find myself using it as prep and taking that and using that time to ahead of the game to be able to modify what it gives me and to build on it. I don't use it very often, like probably like 2 or 3 times out of the number of games that I've run at the actual table.
I will say one thing that I did do, which is kind of world buildy, and I think I shared this out in our Discord, was I told it to create a scream sheet for Cyberpunk Red that includes 5 stories of less than 50 words each, include the day's lottery numbers and 3-day forecast for Night City. And it did it.
Nice.
And it wasn't bad. Right? Again, like, you're going to riff off of it, but it actually came up with appropriately cyberpunkish prompts based on what I gave it. So that was, I was impressed about what it generated.
So, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, I've done some stuff with my Dresden Files game. So we've talked about this before, but my Dresden Files game is in the Dresden Files world, but it's based in Cleveland, which is my hometown. And, when I sat down recently to kind of begin to, because you start a game with like a nub of a thing, and then it just gets bigger and bigger as you go. I decided to go back and do some history and some scenario planning and some individual plot paths for the characters. And so I started with reimagine what you know about Cleveland Mafia history with the spin of putting it in the Dresden Files universe. What does that look like? And it came up with some ideas, so some things that are, I'm going to say, commonly known in Cleveland. And is, just like all local history, local history is local. But, it was able to suggest things that I probably would have landed on my own, but it has all the data there already, So I was able to take that and begin to flesh things out. And then you just begin to pull threads. Well, I've got this one guy who's in the mafia and, but he's got a little bit of talent. How would that play with the winter court thing I have going on? And so, and that kind of goes. And sometimes it's like getting a block of wood and shaving it down and whittling it down into something that you like. But it's worth it to be able to get the quantity of first draft material in your hands.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out something that the two of you have done is when you described it, when you described the prompts that you put into ChatGPT, they were fairly descriptive. Like especially like Ken's scream sheet stuff. Like it sounded, not having worked in newspapers before, but it sounded, because I know Ken has, it sounded like an editor giving requirements out to, to people who are writing articles or putting together a sheet in the newspaper. It's like, I need this much copy. I need this, I need the lottery numbers on this particular page, et cetera, and was pretty detailed about the requirements. And then ChatGPT was like, okay, I can work with that.
Right.
Absolutely.
So just putting in like, hey, design me a game about steampunk. is not a good prompt. It's not going to, it'll give you something, but it's not necessarily going to give you, it'll give you a very rough draft. Whereas, the better the prompt and the better your own imagination into that prompt that you put, it will make for much better output.
There's a concept in creative problem solving methodologies in brainstorming called either it's forced comparison or forced pairing. It's when you take two things that are disparate, put them together and ask people to kind of riff on it, and you get this material. I find that when I create prompts that have 2 or 3 elements that are disparate, it does a fairly decent job of pulling together something that I can begin to whittle down. But to your point, make me a fantasy world is not nearly as good as, make me a fantasy world that's based on 13th century England, but also has the influences of Tarzan or, whatever. I mean, you got to give it something to work with.
Yeah. And it's kind of like how Jim Butcher, who is known to be spiteful for things that in a good way, for things that are like, of course I can do that. At one point his writing teacher told him not to write talking heads. And so the first thing that he did was go back and write Bob in the Dresden Files, which is a literal talking head. But he had the Codex Alera series because he was arguing with, arguing might be a strong word, but was arguing with someone on the internet and saying, I'm maybe even at a con. I don't remember the whole story, but it was basically it boils down to Jim Butcher said, I can write about anything. And he's like, just give me 2 things and I can write something about it. And one of the people went, sure. Write about Pokemon and the Lost Roman Legion. And he's like, okay. And the 3 books of Codex Alera is like, when you read it, it is definitely Pokemon meets the Lost Roman Legion, but you're not seeing, unless you know that story, you don't see the parallels, and it's a good book. And so that's kind of what you can do with ChatGPT is if you give it good prompts, if you're being creative in creating your prompts and detailed with it, you can get some pretty neat stuff out of it.
You won't get Jim Butcher out of it. I mean,
you won't get Jim Butcher out of it. No, please don't. Please don't try and write a novel and submit it with ChatGPT. People have already tried to do that, and they're not good.
The stuff that comes out of ChatGPT always reminds me of the marketing intern. Everything is written. It's got an intro paragraph. It's got 3 paragraphs of supporting material, and then a conclusion, and it all reads like a marketing blog post.
Yep.
And so, if you cut off the end and cut off the beginning and see what you can do with the middle, you might be okay. But do not look for it to do the writing for you. It can help with the ideas, but don't do the writing.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm curious. One of the things I've thought about doing but haven't actually tried is like take the stat block for one of my characters for my campaign and say, come up with an antagonist for this character, or give me 3 antagonists for this character. One a physical based challenge, one a magic based challenge, and one something weird, right? And see what it gives me, right? Like say you have to, again, like I think to your point earlier, right? It's better to specify, here is a character for Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. Please review it. Now, I would like you to generate, and then it might get you something reasonable, at least something that will provide inspiration that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do as quickly on your own.
We've covered a lot of ground. No, we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked. We're moving into kind of our last points here, but we were talking about challenges and limitations. I think we've touched on a number of these. Unpredictability. It can be nonsensical or inappropriate. Not inappropriate in a weird way, but just not like it doesn't land. That kind of it. It doesn't understand human emotions, obviously. It doesn't always get the context. So if you're trying to have it write something that is hooked into human emotions, you're going to get something flat and unappealing. That's okay. You may be able to salvage some things from it, but it's important to note that even if you tell it to imitate one of your favorite writers, it's not going to get it right, and it's not going to have the human touch. These things are terrible authors, but they're great interfaces to data.
Yes.
Yeah. What other items do we have here? We have a note here about the potential to overtake human roles. Current ChatGPT is not going to be replacing your dungeon master anytime soon. It can't remember anything long enough. But as these things get better, I can totally see someone training up a solo RPG based on this, and using a large language model to help run the game.
Yeah, I mean, not to get technical in it, but like there's a little technical, which is there's a bunch of open source models out there that are not necessarily as good as ChatGPT, but they're free and they'll run on your home machine. It would be interesting to see someone put something together that you could run locally that would effectively be a solo RPG that you could talk back and forth with.
I'm sure someone's going to do this. Some college student with more time.
Yeah, I would not be surprised if something like that's already out there and we're just not aware of it. Yeah. I have a lot of editing, by the way, to do for this because of the dogs. So.
And then we didn't go, I'm sorry, go on, Ken. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I was going to say we had a prompt before, and I think it's going to work best when humans are involved. Right. And it's augmenting. So I have an idea, like the beginnings of an idea that we were kind of kicking around on Discord about having a co-op Starforged game where you're using kind of collectively agreed to prompts or some sort of language that we're using to inspire it to say, hey, and now you as a solo character has encountered this particular place, and then you use ChatGPT to generate some information about that, basically serve in that oracle sort of role. Some sort of story happens. And then being able to come back later as a different player or as in a co-op mode, and then have that same encounter in that sort of like, spaceport type thing, right? And so it's already been established, but we've documented it via, a wiki or some other tool because ChatGPT can't remember Jack.
Yeah.
But I think it could be cool in that way where it could enable new styles of play where, the ChatGPT is serving as an intermediary, especially when you're doing something DM-less, right? I think it could just completely fail, but I think it could be interesting to like use a combination of those oracles that we've discussed previously, plus some inspiration from ChatGPT, because it can write a decent description given appropriate prompts.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Starforged, like as an example, if you are delving into an ancient alien monolith. There's a, I don't remember exactly the name for the oracle for it, but there's an oracle that's basically like that. You can use that category and then use ChatGPT instead of rolling. So like if something has led you over to a particular oracle in Starforged, instead of rolling, you could basically prompt ChatGPT to give you, the next thing that you can use it as your oracle. That would be interesting to do.
Yeah, or some interface between the two, like you roll the thing and then you say, I have this character, it's doing this thing, it's found this thing, describe it.
Yep.
I think we're quite away from the generative AI based what was it, like the game in Ender's Game that Ender plays gives him a series of challenges based on him in particular, and it's very dreamlike and weird and all kinds of stuff connecting back to the real world. I think we're way off from that.
I think we are, but I think that things are gonna be catching up faster than you think with Unreal 5. Is it Unreal 5 that it's one of the two big engines? It's either Unreal or
probably Unreal.
I think it's unreal. But they've got a generative tool that will generate landscape just by you dragging it within the game, and it can do it programmatically. And with what Adobe, I know, David, you've been playing with the Adobe tools that do some of this filling. And I think that we're not too far away from someone deciding to make an AI generated version of like a Zork or some sort of text-based game that is potentially infinite. Now, that's not really a thing because it does go back to the same well all the time. But, I'm thinking 5 years.
Yeah,
AI you're going to start seeing these things.
AI has moved, and this kind of comes to our last point, which is ethical considerations, which I've talked about a lot, so I'm not going to dwell on a lot here. AI has moved much, much faster than I had anticipated, and a lot of people have anticipated. There was GitHub's Copilot, which passed our coding test for our company. And so there was a bunch of different things that happened there. And then ChatGPT 3 has been out for a while, and then 3.5 came out, and then 4 very quickly after that. And that kind of blew up. Mid-Journey and Stable Diffusion for image generation has blown up. Some of the ethical considerations are what happens if people use this in a nefarious manner, but also what happens when people use this as a shortcut to hiring actual people. I actually saw a thing from a thing with the Association of Computing Machinery, and the guy was talking about things like GitHub Copilot and saying, if you average things out, that it was I don't know where he got his numbers, probably Silicon Valley, but it was $2,000 a day. That's not what most programmers are paid, but evidently he thought so. Was it's $2,000 a day for a programmer, but it's only 12 cents a day for GitHub Copilot. And he kind of advocated for a project manager to prompt GitHub Copilot to write the programs. Why not spend an extra 12 cents and get an even better programmer instead of replace the $2,000 a day with 12 cents?
Speaking as someone who uses GitHub Copilot almost every day, it's not that perfect. It's handy, but it's not. It cannot replace a programmer yet. Will it be able to do so eventually? I'm sure it will. I have no doubt. But that a lot of these people a lot of these folks have something to sell. Yeah. It reminds me of when Microsoft comes in and offers you a new tool, and it'll get you 80% of the way there, except you've got to backtrack 40% because it doesn't do the thing that you need it to do. Yeah. And so, but ethical considerations are important. I mean, we're talking about this stuff for personal use, and people may have an issue with that. I mean, I know Chuck Wendig famously called ChatGPT a plagiarism machine. And strictly speaking, he's not wrong. I mean, and I guess to some degree, I can be a plagiarism machine if I'm not paying attention, or But I guess the point is that you should do some thinking about this. You should put some boundaries around it. I have come across people on the internet talking about how you too can use this to write your novel and get it up on Amazon, and you certainly could. Yeah, but it's going to be terrible. And I guess if making a few bucks is all that you're interested in, you can't stop someone from doing that. Right. But personally, I think there's something to the human touch that it lacks so far.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why the Writers Guild of America and a little bit with SAG-AFTRA, that's some of their demands in their negotiations is around AI. The Secret Invasion, Marvel Secret Invasion, the intro is made by AI. It's a really cool-ish looking intro, but the director, who I believe it was the director who basically commissioned it, didn't really know anything about AI. And so it's like, doesn't, since there's so much of that image generation AI that is trained on people's copyrighted artwork that have not been compensated for that copyright. Yeah. I mean, I said I wasn't going to go delve into ethical considerations too much, but here I am. I do suggest that AI is here. It's going to stay. We need to, it's kind of like the Luddites. They didn't throw their shoes into the weaving machines to stop progress. They wanted to slow it down so that people would think about how we're using it. And so think about how you're using the AI. Think about, could it hurt people? Could this be a problem? But if you're using it at home with your home group, I don't see a problem really at this point. I'm gonna make sure that, as all humans do, we can change our minds. But right now, I don't see the harm in using it to increase your entertainment at home when you're playing with your friends. So I recommend it. I'm going to continue to use it at home, at least. We've got a couple of articles as well that we'll attach in the show notes about similar stuff like this, which is using ChatGPT and other AI pieces, like maybe Midjourney, to be an assistant dungeon master, which is what we've been talking about here. Does anybody want to put any last minute things while my dog barks outside?
I'll say a little bit about what my dream would be, because as I've been working with it, I feel that I want Scalzi's brain pal from like the Old Man's War, the original book, right? Like I find myself, and I get that this is a dangerous road, but I feel like, and we're not there yet, but I think to your point, Chris, we probably will be very, very soon, where you want that like AI assistant that's actually helping you out. And like you're sitting down at your desk and you're like, okay, Hal, we're going to go work on an elemental apocalypse. Get ready to talk about it. This is where we left off. And then just like, boom, it's getting the context of where I'm currently at and working with. Now I get a little bit of that from my chat conversations with ChatGPT, but it's not seamless yet. It's not the sci-fi future that we anticipated or have been looking forward to. But I think, as we've discussed in previous times, perhaps even online, we didn't necessarily think through the consequences of that and where all of that stuff was coming from.
Yeah,
but
it's too easy to go from utopian ideals to actual dystopia. There
are dangers here, and there's a lot of conversation. We don't have to talk about it here.
Right.
Probably it's a separate show in and of itself, but you're either going to get fully automated luxury communism or a William Gibson novel. And I don't think there's a whole lot of room between the
luxury communism. I don't think I've ever heard that term before.
It's a book I'm reading right now, but I mean, let's face it, Star Trek, the Gene Roddenberry Star Trek future is fully automated luxury communism.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Which is funny because there are friends of mine who would totally disagree with communism, but absolutely love Star Trek. And I don't think that they realize, the difference there. What I will say is, if you guys want to talk about the ethics of it, or we definitely want to hear ways you've used it at home, please send us feedback. Thanks for listening. You can send feedback to podcast@layerofsecrets.com. This will be on YouTube. You can put it in the comments section over there. We're mostly over on Mastodon, dice.camp/@layerofsecrets. That's probably the best place to put any feedback, because we'll actually see it more quickly and be able to respond and actually have a conversation. You can also visit layerofsecrets.com, which is the main base of our layer. And you can leave us feedback, topic ideas, and find all the other social sites that we exist on over there at layerofsecrets.com. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.